Opposition Senator Ramon Small-Ferguson delivered a strong critique of Jamaica's asset tax, making it clear that in his view, the tax should be completely removed, not adjusted or delayed. Senator Small-Ferguson argued that the asset tax was originally introduced during a time of national economic crisis and structural reform. According to him, it was meant to be temporary, a short-term measure to help stabilize the country's finances. Now that Jamaica is no longer in that crisis period, he said there is no justification for keeping the tax in place. He explained that the asset tax is fundamentally unfair because it does not tax profits or business success. Instead, it taxes companies simply for owning assets or having capital on their balance sheets. In his view, this means businesses are being penalized even when they are not making money, a situation he described as economically harmful and inefficient.
Truth is that this tax affects ordinary Jamaicans in a few ways. One is that it increases the cost of borrowing from banks by virtue of the fact that they have to incur the costs. Two, investors and pensioners are adversely impacted because financial stocks are unable to pay a requisite level of dividends by virtue of this asset tax.
While the government argued that recent amendments would ease compliance and help with post-disaster recovery, Senator Small-Ferguson rejected that approach. He stated that adjusting deadlines or administrative rules misses the core issue. In his view, the real question is not how the tax is managed, but whether it should exist at all.
The bill proposes to amend the filing and payment date for the asset tax. It doesn't reduce the tax. It doesn't phase it out. It does not commit to removing the tax. It simply changes the date when it's filed and when it's paid. And while these administrative adjustments may be necessary from time to time, this amendment, in our view, misses the central issue in relation to this tax entirely. Because, Mr. President, the real issue with respect to the asset tax is not when the tax should be paid. The real issue is whether the tax, which is currently a burden to financial institutions, its customers, and its shareholders, should continue to exist at all. Mr. President, let's speak plainly about why this tax is problematic. The asset tax does not tax profit. It doesn't tax success. It taxes the mere existence of capital. You're being punished for putting capital to work in the economy. In simple terms, a financial institution pays the tax whether it makes money or not. I mean, I don't think anybody could argue that that sounds inconsistent. It pays whether the economy is strong or weak. It pays whether lending and investing is booming or slowing. This is not how most taxes work, Mr. President. Normally, when a business earns more, it pays more. When it earns less, it pays less. That is fair and logical. But this tax does not move with performance. It's fixed against the size of a company's balance sheet. So even in difficult times, even when margins are tight, even when institutions are trying to support recovery, as all financial institutions should be doing now, the tax remains. It means, Mr. President, that the cost of this tax doesn't simply sit on the books of the financial institution. It shows up in higher borrowing costs. It shows up in lower dividends to all investors, to include pensioners, all investors, small and large. It reduces the investment capacity of financial institutions, and there is less room for these institutions to support businesses and individuals. It quietly, like a phantom, increases the cost of capital in this country. And in a developing country like Jamaica, capital is not a luxury. We're a country with scarce resources, as we are constantly reminded. Capital is what? Finances, homes, businesses, infrastructure, and jobs. Exactly. The tax is distortionary, and that's the issue surrounding it. It affects the ability of Jamaicans to borrow, to invest, to save, and to earn ultimately. And that is why this tax, by its very design, works against the growth that we say that we want to achieve in this stage of our history. Mr. President, so you may ask yourself, why was this tax introduced to begin with? And that is an important context to set. The asset tax was introduced at a time when the country faced unsustainable debt, limited fiscal space, and severe economic vulnerability. Jamaica's recovery from that point did not happen by accident. It was the result of deliberate legislative and fiscal reforms, including the necessary restructuring of Jamaica's debt through the National Debt Exchange, the imposition of fiscal discipline, through binding fiscal rules, and the country's engagement with the International Monetary Fund in 2013 after we effectively abandoned them by the previous administration. Right? It was the People's National Party who made the hard decisions at that time to introduce this tax. Those reforms were understandably imposed at that time and caused a burden on the economy. But it is important to state, that that burden was ultimately borne by Jamaicans. It was borne by our financial services sector. It was borne by Jamaican investors. The National Debt Exchange required domestic institutions, pension funds, individual investors to accept lower yields, extend maturities, and reduce returns in order to help to stabilize the country's finances. And at that time, the financial services sector stepped up in the national interest. They accepted those sacrifices because they understood, all Jamaicans understood, that these measures were necessary for a time to restore Jamaica's stability. And because they were assured that these measures, these extraordinary measures, were only being introduced for a period and that they were temporary, they acted in good faith. Mr. President, these sacrifices were a bridge to carry us from the instability that the government of the day inherited to the stability that is celebrated in the current day. Right? It was a bridge from the instability that the government of the day inherited to the stability that we celebrate today. Mr. President, I contend that that bridge is now crossed. The very reforms, Mr. President, that were required and those sacrifices that were made, they succeeded. The debt has declined significantly. Fiscal stability has now been restored. Jamaica's macroeconomic credibility has been reestablished. Yet, several of the temporary measures, Mr. President, introduced during that time remain in place, to include this one. What was introduced was meant to be extraordinary, and it has now become ordinary. And that raises serious questions, Mr. President, about fairness and credibility. Mr. President, there is near universal agreement across institutions, administrations, and across the financial services system that the asset tax is distortionary and it should not exist as a permanent feature in our tax regime. The International Monetary Fund, as far back as 2016, at that time, contemplated that the government would make due on its commitment to remove the asset tax. And they explicitly welcomed the intention to remove the asset tax, recognizing the distortionary nature of it. The current government itself has acknowledged on several occasions that the tax is distortionary. In his presentation of the 2020-2021 budget, the former Minister of Finance, Dr. Nigel Clark, in announcing an intention to reduce the asset tax from 0.25% to 0.125%, noted that the tax was distortionary, and although it was levied on financial institutions, it was filtering through to ordinary Jamaicans, to the borrowing public, to investors, and that it was a disincentive to house assets here in Jamaica. That sounds counter to what we want. The statement was also consistent with the government's decision to abolish the asset tax for unregulated entities in 2019. Right? So only the financial institutions bear the burden now. The private sector organization of Jamaica, under its immediate past president, Mr. Mitri Siaga, wrote formally to the minister in 2023 on behalf of the Jamaica Bankers Association, the Jamaica Securities Dealers Association, and the Jamaica Insurance Association, calling for the removal of the asset tax and reminding the government of its commitment to do so. There's no serious institutional voice that can argue that this tax is sound economic policy. Mr. President, it's also important to recognize that the financial services sector did not only step up in 2013 when the reforms were initially made, but continued to act in good faith even when Jamaica's fiscal position had improved. When the government proposed, Mr. President, to remove or reduce rather the asset tax from 0.25% to 0.125%, the reduction was ultimately deferred with the consent of the sector as the pandemic fell upon us in March of 2020. Right? The sector accepted the continuation of this higher tax rate during a period of national interest, recognizing the extraordinary circumstances that were facing us at that time. That was another sacrifice that was made, Mr. President, in good faith. It was understood, however, that this would be temporary, and that once the crisis passed, the original commitment to reduce the tax would ultimately be fulfilled. Yet, here we are years later, still collecting the tax. This is not consistent with the commitments that were made. Mr. President, we recognize the time, right? The minister referenced the worst disaster that we have faced in our history, possibly, that is Hurricane Melissa. And we're now faced with a period of reconstruction and recovery, and what is expected to be a temporary blip to our fiscal situation. But Mr. President, as I have said before in this honorable house, national recovery requires capital. The government cannot do it alone. It requires investment. It requires lending. It requires strong financial institutions, Mr. President, capable of supporting economic rebuilding. Yet we continue to penalize those very institutions that will be central and very important to supporting the recovery of our economy. That's counterproductive, Mr. President. Beyond the economics, there is a fundamental question, Mr. President, of credibility here, right? And let's just lay that on the table, and principle with respect to the government. During Jamaica's reform period, the financial services sector, Jamaican investors, and the ordinary Jamaican bore significant burdens, whether obvious or otherwise, in the national interest. We participated in the national debt exchange. We absorbed those reduced returns. We accepted the asset tax during the pandemic, understanding the extraordinary measures that needed to be taken at that time. And those sacrifices were made in good faith, understanding that this thing was not going to be a permanent feature of the system. That's the principle at stake. Right? And we have seen this play out in other places where temporary measures have become permanent measures without even reference to them. When the withdrawals from the National Housing Trust, Mr. President, began years ago, it was strongly opposed by the party that forms the current government, right? But the administration of the day recognized the need for extraordinary sacrifice, temporary sacrifice. Yet, over a decade after the withdrawals were supposed to end, 10 years, they have conveniently continued over $110 billion, Mr. President, incremental to what was contemplated, have been withdrawn. It's not an issue of rhetoric, it's about consistency. I say I'm going to do this, and then I do something else because it is convenient. If extraordinary measures are justified during a crisis, and we've been hearing that, right? Then they must be reassessed once stability returns. Otherwise, what we introduced as temporary becomes enduring extraction. And when commitments are not honored, Mr. President, confidence in fiscal policy is going to be weakened, right? So, Mr. President, at its core, this matter is one of principle. Right? Extraordinary measures introduced during a time of crisis, such as the asset tax, must not become permanent features of the system long after the crisis has passed and without further reference or mention. When sacrifices are made in the national interest, Mr. President, and when reform succeeds, there must be a corresponding commitment to unwind the temporary burdens that are put forward as part of those recovery efforts. That's the basis of credibility. That's the basis of trust. And that's the basis of sound fiscal policy. What is required now is not a further administrative adjustment to the policy, but a clear commitment from the government, one that they actually keep this time around. We believe, Mr. President, that the government should commit, of course, in the context of fiscal conditions normalizing post-recovery from Hurricane Melissa, to a clear plan to phase out this distortionary tax. The plan should be time-bound and should be legislated, because it is clear that if it isn't legislated, it won't happen. Right? Sounds familiar? Mr. President, this is the kind of signal that Jamaica needs, with the government honoring its commitments in this regard, not only when it is convenient to do so, right, and not when temporary measures are introduced that become permanent. They shouldn't be allowed to quietly become permanent. The government should be upfront about it. There are some people who have gone further than I have in relation to the phasing out of this tax and have called for or suggested that the amounts that have been collected beyond what was originally intended in relation to this tax, that those amounts should be rebated. There are people who have called for that, and that's a separate matter, Mr. President. The immediate and I think reasonable ask is far simpler, which is a clear and structured path to bring this tax to an end. Mr. President, Jamaica's recovery was built on discipline, reform, and shared sacrifice. Sacrifice that we on this side own. Completing that reform, Mr. President, it requires consistency. Right? It requires principle, Mr. President. And the time has come, Mr. President, to provide clarity, to restore balance, and to phase out this temporary measure in a deliberate and credible way. If it pleases you, Mr. President.
Thanks for staying until the end. And don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe.